Hi, everyone. I'm Winifred Lewis, a professor in the School of Psychology at the University of Queensland. I come from Canada originally, as you can hear from my accent, but I've been in Brisbane since 2001. I grew up in Toronto and Montreal. Paul?
Paul Harnett, Associate Professor in Criminology nowadays at Griffith University, but I was in the School of Psychology and Clinical Psychology Training team from 2003.
Yeah. And Valerie?
Valerie Stone. I fled from the US in 2003 to Australia and joined the School of Psychology. I came with an interest in Indigenous issues, even though that wasn't directly related to my research area.
Yeah. You were working as a neuroscientist at the time and now a practicing clinician, right? Yeah.
Yes.
A social psychologist. I don't know if I said that. And I think the three of us really were responding to your leadership call. You had been developing relationships with the folks at the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies Unit. Can you tell us how, from your perspective, the workshop events came to pass?
Well, I originally from New Zealand and had done my clinical psychology training in New Zealand, where Maori issues were taken seriously. And when I got to Australia and saw what was happening in clinical psychology training in Australia and the complete absence of recognition of First Nations issues, I thought that needed to change. So I reached out to the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Studies Unit, Michael Williams, Jackie Huggins at the time, and met with them just to form a relationship. So I just had no particular agenda other than to make that connection and to get some advice on how one might go about introducing it into the curriculum.
Yeah. I remember us having a conversation with Michael Williams where we talked about whether psychology training was too soul destroying and might be appropriate to guide Indigenous students who are interested in issues of well-being to social work, which was seen as more friendly and welcoming and less hierarchical, and not to put too fine a point on it, racist, right? So the context was certainly not one where the issues were discussed. And when you developed the idea for what became a full-day event on Indigenous mental health that touched on themes of colonization and intergenerational trauma, as well as other topics, there wasn't, in fact, a mad rush to embrace it, right? Can you talk?
No, it's been a long battle. I suspect, even now we could say that it's not been embraced as anywhere near as much as it should be. So there's still a lot of work to be done, but at the time it was there was very little to nothing. That the only input were these one-day workshops, which were voluntary, and they were outside the School of Psychology. We ran them over the rooms in the student centre, and students and staff could sign up to them if they wanted to go. It was completely voluntary. And we got about 70, 80 people each year for the 2 or 3 years that we ran them. So there was interest. So I was able to
particularly from students.
Yeah. So we're able to make a case, that there is students out there who want to hear about this and learn about it, and that we should have a course within the School of Psychology.
Yeah, and just before we get to that course, do you want to comment, Valerie, on why we supported it as social psychologists and neuroscientists? I think it was really coming out of our past interest in seeing these issues addressed and recognizing that there is an enormous well-being and clinical impact.
Yeah, and I think prior to that, you and I, Winifred, had been to a number of like NIDOC events and
Yeah.
Marches and talks, and we were trying to figure out what to do.
Yeah.
So it was
to the professional space that we're working in, the clinical space. Obviously, in our research, it's a little bit easier to have these initiatives. But I think that what was important about the training, Paul, was the way that you were able to transition it from that voluntary one-day event to the course. Can you tell us about the course?
The course was an honors course. So it was a special topic course, and it was capped at 20 students. And being a non-Indigenous person, I wasn't going to convene that course, particularly in the early days when I didn't know anywhere near enough. So Michael Williams, the director of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies Unit, asked Stephen Corporal, who's a First Nations man, to co-convene it with me. So, and how the course worked was I invited community members to come in and each week. So First Nations people would come in to the classroom and they would run the sessions, and I would sit back and listen really and learn. So I was kind of like a student in my own course in a way, and that was so the course really worked because I spent a lot of time trying to make connections out in the community, and made a lot of connections. And I'd every time I met a First Nations person, pretty much I would say, "Could you come in? Would you be willing to come into the university and talk to my students?" And I said, "Oh, sure." So over the years, I had a lot of people I could call on who would come in and run the course. So I, as a non-Indigenous person, I could run the course, but only with the help of the community. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think if we think about sort of lessons and from these particular initiatives, we're going to talk in a moment about a separate initiative, the School Psychology Reconciliation Action Plan. To me, like some of the learnings were, firstly, there was this enormous groundswell of interest. So the initiatives that, to offer the voluntary training benefited dozens and dozens of staff and students. And that's just something that anyone can be mindful of, because sometimes if you just step forward, there is a need there that you can help to be part of the change. And another part was when it was institutionalized reluctantly and in the form of this smaller course, which offered this incredibly valuable positive training to 20 students a year. But our honors program is 150 students a year, so that it didn't make it into the widespread curriculum at that time, and there was resistance to that. There was pushback. But you mentioned that some of the guys went on from your course, your honors course, to subsequently work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community groups, and that's just unbelievably great for them, and that is for the psychologists, hopefully also for the community groups. An empirical question. What are some thoughts that you have about those initiatives, Paul?
So which initiatives?
The one-day workshop and the course.
And the course, yeah. My main thought is that it just wasn't enough, and there was a few of us in the school at the time that could see the importance of having a lot more content, and it was just very frustrating. And so while they were really good initiatives, it just wasn't enough. So
that's an important point. What was your reflection, Valerie, as you look back on that time and those changes?
So I should probably mention that by the time the workshops came around, I was only at UQ for another couple of years. So, and then I left academia, returned to North America, and then I underwent clinical training. What I remember and what I always tell people, and I have shared the story of those workshops with many people, is that, when we say it's about Indigenous mental health, this was not about white psychologists giving tips on mental health to Aboriginal people. It's about white psychologists. White psychologists learning the ways in which our own culture does not promote mental wellness.
Yeah.
And how colonization impacts all of us. And I felt that those Aboriginal people who were willing to teach us were very generous and open-hearted in helping us learn how we are all affected by colonization.
It's really great to reflect on that